Welcome. My name is Donna Sieber. I am a CCL member, both through the Boulder chapter and with the University of Colorado chapter. And I'm pleased to welcome our speaker, John Stulp. He's a Southeastern farmer here in Colorado and was the former Commissioner of Agriculture for Governor Ritter. I have kind of a very personal and deep connection to this topic of farmers and climate change. I am fourth generation, a product of 4 generations of farmers a little bit east of here in Nebraska. And I think forming alliances with farmers and that whole community is going to be an important part of our strategy in getting carbon fee and dividend passed. So I'll turn it over to John.
Susan, and thank you for the invitation to be here today and visit with you about climate change and a farmer's perspective. As my intro was mentioned, I've had the opportunity to work with Governor Ritter as well as with John Hickenlooper in the water sector, and so if I regress into water sometimes, you'll understand why. But the fact is, water is so important to agriculture and to our overall climate that they are tied together, always will be. And I hope I can make it to Brad Udall's presentation tomorrow morning because I have high respect for Brad and his vision for climate change and what's happening in our planet. So I want to introduce myself to you a little bit on why I do the things I do and through some slides here. This is if you're traveling down 287 south of Lamar, Colorado, and look to the right on the hill there is our farm. It's actually a 3rd generation farm, even though I'm going to talk a little more about that just in just a second. But we're primarily a dryland wheat operation. By dryland, that means we have no supplemental irrigation. We depend on what Mother Nature gives us, and then we deal with it. And then we're also a livestock operation. We have a cow-calf operation, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So one of the reasons I do the things I do is because of future generation. This is 12 of our 13 grandchildren. And not that we don't love their parents, but you know, there's a special spot in your heart for grandchildren and their enthusiasm, and yet the concern I have is what's our future going to look like? We were fortunate in our family of 5 children to entice 2 of them back into agriculture. The other 3 are engineers doing much better than those of us in agriculture, to be real honest about it, financially. But there's certain rewards from agriculture and rural living that you can't put a price tag on. And so out of these 13, we do hope there's an opportunity for 2 or 3 or 4 of them to come back into some form of agriculture. We are a family that's been in Colorado for over 100 years. If I go back to my great-grandfather Snyder, who I knew fairly well, I'd probably be 10 years older of farming and ranching in Colorado. And so some of the stories I'm going to tell you aren't because I was around then, it's because I heard them from my grandparents. And but that helped formulate, I think, some of my vision of the future and of climate. And I also think it has an impact on why farmers and ranchers tend to be somewhat resistant to the term of climate change because they have been living in it for generations. They went through the dirty 30s, they went through the dirty 50s, they went through the late 70s, they went through 2002 and 3 major droughts, as well as in 12. And their theory is that, and I talked to a neighbor the other day because I was kind of fishing for anecdotal information for this discussion. He said, I put in 45 crops in Colorado. And he said, some of them were wet, some of them were dry, some of them were great, some of them weren't so great. And so that's kind of the farmer's experience of working the land and watching the weather. And so we'll talk a little more about that a little bit. This is on one of my son's farms. This is the Lamar Utility Board, a couple of the turbines. There's actually 4 on this site. 1 on the neighbor, 3 on our son. Then we're harvesting dryland wheat at the same time we're enjoying the income from the wind farm. We also have just started recipients of some other turbines on the south end, about 25 miles south of here. We owned a little land, and it was interesting. We come somewhat late to southeast Colorado, and all the fertile low ground was kind of occupied or bought up, and the cheaper land was the hilly stuff that didn't produce as well and that sort of thing. But now it turns out those hills are really good places for wind farms. And so what goes around comes around. Well, we're in the food business. It says wheat, cattle, and kids. We do these things for the next generation, and we'll talk about how we want to leave it for them too. We look at and I know you have a lot of these statistics in mind, just by the nature of your organization. And I often don't talk to people that have probably the climate knowledge that you all represent. But I just wanted to point out that we're on a very thin edge sometimes on our food production on a global basis. We're very fortunate that we're in one of the bread baskets of the world, the United States. But about 60% of our food calories come from about 5 major countries. The good news is Argentina, United States, and Brazil, we're pretty much in the same part of the globe, and we're not having the impacts that other parts of the world. Although we do have impacts, but perhaps not as severely. Mostly the 4 larger crops that contribute to the calories are rice, wheat, potatoes, and corn. So depending on what your diet is, we're all in this together. As we look at global temperatures since the 1800s, there's a pretty dramatic change. And sometimes those of us that are out there day after day don't always see that, and it's always good to have the statistics to take a better look at this and realize there is something going on and what's causing it. And it's not just global, it's here in Colorado. As we worked on Colorado Water Plan over the last several years, we were painfully aware that, and you'll hear some of this I think from Brad, that we may have 15 to 20% less water in the Colorado River system by the year 2050. And that will greatly impact not only our ability to produce Palisade peaches and grapes and things like that in the Western Slope or livestock, but it will impact our recreational community. And so there's great economic concerns on if these trends continue. 15 to 20% is what the estimates are by 2050. This is kind of reiteration of what I mentioned a while ago. We're seeing significant measurable reductions in food production in Europe, South Africa, and Australia. Generally, it's positive for Latin America. It's interesting that where some of the countries like China, even though they're a great food producer, they're not producing enough food with their system for their population. And so they're making investments in Africa, they're making investments in South America. They just recently announced that they're doing a major dredging in one of the major rivers in Argentina in order to get barges further inland in Argentina to pick up soybeans and other grains. And so some of our competitors in the world food market are concerned about their future and are actually investing in other parts of the world. And I think climate change has a lot to do with those attitudes. Recent climate change has increased the yields of certain crops in some areas of the upper Midwest United States. And so it's hard to convince a farmer or rancher in that area that climate change is something to be feared or to have a concern about. And what's happening, if you look at the Dakotas, was typically a durum and winter wheat type of agriculture as well as grazing. has become significant producers of corn and soybean. And it's because the frost-free period of growing has lengthened, and so they're able to get crops in earlier after the freezes, and it's become a fairly productive area with a lot of grain coming out of that area. At the same time, we're seeing some parts of Iowa that traditionally, could grow corn off the asphalt, I think, having sporadic droughts. And so, it's interesting to see what parts of the United States are having record yields, and to talk to them about they should be concerned or doing something about climate change. And then in case in our own farm, we had a record wheat crop this year for non-irrigated cropland in our area. And so I only wish my father-in-law and my great-grandfather were around to have seen it, because they thought, they had hit some very good yields in the 40s, and then we almost doubled that this year. But there's no, this is one thing that as a scientist background and that I worry about, is how much CO2 we're putting in the atmosphere. China and US are the leading contributors to that. I think there's some other factors in there, but still this is a thing that concerns me. One of the, on carbon emissions, one of those graphs you've probably seen, that how CO2 were over 410, something like that, parts per million now. That worries me too. But many farmers, ranchers will say, well, CO2 is good for the crops. And at certain levels it is, but you can have too much of a good thing. It's kind of like when I talk to sixth graders about chemicals, and they think they're all bad. And then we talk about, do you use a little bit of salt on your, in your diet? And yes, and is that a chemical? Well, yes, it is. And so you can kill yourself by eating too much salt, and yet it's essential for life. And so it's really a balance and understanding what's going on there. And so when we talk about carbon emissions and higher CO2 levels, it doesn't alarm people that are growing plants as much as it does a lot of the other parts of our society. Same way with methane. Agriculture and agriculture waste are certain contributors to that. Also, obviously, wetlands. We're trying to restore more wetlands, and so some agriculturists say, okay, we're restoring more wetlands, and you're wanting me to reduce methane production out of my dairy or my cattle feeding operation. There's no question about the increase in disasters that we're seeing, and this is just one slide for 2018, billion-dollar weather and climate-related disasters. They're all over the United States. We went back and looked at in 2012 what happened just in Colorado with the drought, and we could identify a conservative amount, about $750 million of impact that one-year drought had. And did anybody notice it? Did the price of food go up a lot? Probably not. And so it was absorbed by those farmers, those ranchers that were in the epicenter of that drought. Another thing that's interesting, at that same time we struggled with a year of drought, California was in about the end of 5 years of drought, and they had over $5 to $7 billion of impact to just their agriculture community, and then that ripples through the rest of their local economy. Another thing that isn't publicized well is the fact that their energy prices in that period went up about $1 billion a year, and that was because less water in their systems for the value of hydropower, and so they had to go out on the market and was probably buying fossil fuel type of energy. This is just a collection of different types of regional weather and climate disasters that have impacted our parts of the world. It's kind of interesting, when we look at wildfires, it also looks at the absence of winter storms because we really depend a lot on our snowpack. And so when we have low snowpack, we can be almost assured that we're going to have more difficult fire season in the future. Case in point, this last year, great snowpack. We've had a few forest fires, wildland fires, but nothing like we'd had back in 2012. Flooding, I think we were talking, was the last night or earlier this morning about, was it 6 years ago, the 2013 flood that impacted this part of Colorado. And so we are seeing, even though we're not a high flood area, it's interesting, FEMA's starting to realize that we have different kinds of floods in the West. They're used to a Mississippi a floodplain type of flood that comes up and goes down. They're not used to a canyon type of flood that comes roaring down out of the mountains and wipes out whole towns. Also, we're seeing more extreme rain events like I just mentioned. The problem is for agriculture is we're also seeing higher temperatures following rain events, or year-round for that matter. We're setting a number of records for the high-low of the day. In other words, in Colorado, we typically love the fact that we might get to 90, 100 degrees, but we'll cool down to 60 or maybe even 50 degrees at night. And the plants can recover, the people can recover, but we're not seeing as much of that. And so we're seeing some records set on maybe we only get down to 75 or 74 degrees at night at sometimes. It doesn't allow that vegetation to recover as well for the next heat the next day. And so this will, in the long run, I think, impact our ability to produce as abundantly as we have. This slide I want to spend just a little time on. These are U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. The preponderance of it is obviously carbon dioxide. And then when we look at these sources of the greenhouse gases, agriculture represents 9%. These are U.S. figures. And the thing that I think frustrates a lot of agriculture producers is when they see statistics, we talked about 24% of greenhouse gases are coming from agriculture. And that's probably true on a global basis. But it doesn't give the American farmer credit for what they've been doing over the last 20, 30 years. And so if the rest of the world was doing as good a job at reducing greenhouse gases, we wouldn't have that 24% globally. And so be careful who you condemn on who's producing greenhouse gases. You know, the thing is, if it wasn't for people, we wouldn't have this greenhouse gas problem. But we have people, we're going to have more people, and they're going to eat. And so how do we efficiently address climate change within our own sectors? Because another part, and I'm going to have to talk to that economist a little more, because one of the problems with agriculture is we're price takers. In other words, when I get a load of diesel delivered, I know what the price per gallon is. And if it goes up 80 cents, I know what it's going to be. But I can't automatically raise the price of wheat, or I can't raise the price of my beef. I kind of wait until I go to the market and see what I'll get. And unfortunately, that's just the nature of agriculture. And so I can't pass on an 80 cent a gallon increase in diesel fuel like maybe the retailer can on a price of clothing or even groceries in the grocery store. And so we've got to be careful of not whitewashing or going over some of this stuff real fast, and to know how some of this might impact certain industries. When we look at Colorado's greenhouse gas emissions, agriculture has reduced their footprint by, I think, a couple percent. I don't know how you can measure it that precisely, to be real honest about it, but at least I think some of the things happening in Colorado are going in the right direction when it comes to agriculture. But we've seen an uptick in, obviously, energy, and we're big energy users in agriculture, whether it's in the form of power for the equipment or processing or transportation. Let me talk a little bit about some of the practices, farmers tend to use the best technology that's affordable and available at the time. Now this is looking back almost 2 centuries, and this guy with a plow, my great-grandfathers and grandfather farmed that way for a while. And the biggest improvement in that plow was what John Deere did for it. He figured out how to get a plow that would scour. In other words, the wet dirt wouldn't stick to the moldboard. It would peel off. Took less energy for the horse, so that's a 2-horse plow there, 2-horsepower plow. And so there's, at the time, farmers have accepted the technology that's best at the time. And looking back in my way of farming now, I say, why would you ever plow the ground? Because we're trying to get our soil health better, and if you get abundant rainfall, it can make up for it. There's an old saying that a 2-inch rain makes a good farmer out of everybody. And but the best advice I ever got when I started farming was just farm like you've had your last rain, and you'll get along fine. That way you'll appreciate the rain you do get. A lot of our agriculture around the world is still done like it was 2 centuries ago by hand. And that picture over there is probably 150 years old, but it's interesting. A friend of mine went to China several years ago with the Secretary of Agriculture, and he said they went by a wheat field, and there were 5,000 workers getting ready to harvest the wheat. And they come back by that same spot 2 days later, and it was over a 1,000-acre field was gone. It had all been harvested by hand. And that's one of the issues that the Chinese are having, is the displacement of rural workers. They don't know what to do with them if they take them off the land. And so, unfortunately, they're using some fairly old techniques. Okay, this could easily be my grandfather updating to a plow that he could ride on rather than walk behind for day after day. And this is what we're using today. He's got a 2-horsepower rig. The corner of this rig here is probably a 400-horsepower rig in order to pull a disc if that's necessary. Same way on planting. A horse-drawn 100 years ago, 150 years ago. This is an interseeder type of implement that can, when you put enough down pressure on it, you can almost plant through concrete, almost. But anyway, it's amazing how hard the ground and how much residue you can plant. And in our no-till operations, we're using things like this in order, the only time we disturb the soil is to put a small slit in the soil about 3 inches deep to place the seed and then cover it up. And then I'll let the seed do its thing. And same way with the harvesting, that combine over there probably costs $300,000 if you buy a new one today. The harvesting equipment, the reason I left that slide in there is, as a young kid, I got to ride up on one of these. There's a platform up there where 2 people were managing the combine. Well, this was just a place for the kids to run around on and hopefully not get maimed by the machinery. But my dad would put us up there to get us out of the way, and he would pull the combine through the field that looked very similar to that. And now today we're harvesting about 10 times an hour with modern combines, is what my dad did 50 years ago. We're using a number of different techniques in agriculture here in Colorado. Precision agriculture, being able to apply chemicals at very small amounts and very precisely. This has saved us a lot of fuel. It's one thing that drove us to no-till. I don't know what drove us, but it incentivized us to go to no-till was the fact that diesel went up to $3.50 a gallon. It was costing us about a gallon an hour to do tillage. And with a spray rig like this, it's about 1/10 of a gallon per acre to apply chemicals, pesticides. And now, I'll talk a little bit about it later, but the price of chemicals has gone up dramatically. But at least the price of our diesel has gone down. In the middle there is a no-till drill, similar to that one on the other picture. Can plant through about anything. And again, it's guided by global positioning software that allows you to drive a very straight furrow, which I'd never been able to do until GPS comes along. Advancing technology over there on the right side is a combine harvesting wheat with a shell-borne stripper header. And you got to be careful in your terminology in agriculture. We talk about using strippers a lot, and in some circles, why that means something else, I understand. But this platform is rather unique. Rather than the old reel that brought the grain in and you cut it off, there's a set of fingers underneath there, and I've got one more picture of that, that actually go the opposite direction. And they basically strip the grain out of the head of standing wheat. And so that machine becomes just a grain cleaner for the most part. It's not thrashing the heads or anything like that. All the thrashing is done out there in that gray and blue header. And so it saves energy. It doesn't take as much energy because you don't have to run all that straw through the combine. We can go much faster. And so it's rather a unique improvement of technology. And then at the same time, the reason we like it so well is this residue that's left behind is the whole wheat plant less the grain. And it's standing up there, it becomes a nice windbreak to stop the wind from getting down on the soil. It's also slows down the snow and actually will fill the stubble up sometimes with a lot of snow, and so we keep the moisture out there on the field. Language really matters. And unfortunately, when we talk about changing climates, there's probably not much that farmers haven't seen. This habul or dust cloud coming across the portion of our farm about 6 years ago come from about 80 miles away. And so sometimes when you see this, it wasn't Stulp Farms that created that. We end up being the recipients of it because as the front come through, it picked up a lot of dirt and brought it out. And so immediately people were concerned, well, actually my wife took that picture, that they must be terrible farmers down there, when it was because of a significant drought 75 miles north of us. But it just shows you how insignificant we are sometimes with all this big fancy equipment and all this technology. Mother Nature kind of shows us who's really in charge sometimes, because we can do all these things, but if we don't get rain or if we don't get snow, they're somewhat for naught. And so I mentioned earlier that many farmers are not interested in climate change, but we have talked to them, and I'm going to be using this slide deck somewhat modified here next month as we go around the state and talk to groups of farmers, talking about energy efficiency and some new things that they might want to try, or at least praise them for the things they are doing a good job at. And we've done some surveys, and weather variability is fairly well accepted. And so I've often said, let's use the word climate whatever. I don't want to offend anybody, but I do want them to be thinking about the climate and what our impacts are, our emissions, and then what are some of the potential solutions that agriculture can provide. We are adapting to the changes. We're farming so much differently than what our forefathers did with diverse crop rotations. If you have adequate moisture in your particular area that you're farming, why some of the legume crops can actually replace the need to fertilize as much. We're integrating livestock with our crop production systems. In our part of the world, southeast Colorado, about half of the ground is cultivated. The other half is almost impossible to cultivate. It's too rocky, it's too steep. And so that's where we run most of our livestock. And yet at the same time, because that grass only grows about 5 or 6 months out of the year, if we're fortunate, during the other part of the year, we have to have supplemental feed. And that's when we bring them onto our croplands to utilize the residue from the crops, and sometimes if we're fortunate enough to have the moisture, we have volunteer wheat that we can graze. And so we get kind of a double bang. We get grain and we get some livestock forage out of the integrating livestock in our systems. We think it improves the soil quality as long as we can leave more residue on top. We don't like to see any more flowing out of our fields after a rain event than anybody else does, because that represents dollars and cents. That's fertilizer value, that's the labor and the cost of putting it in place. We are very cognizant of pesticides because our family's out there working, and we don't want to expose them or our water source to any more pesticides than you do. And we're also implementing more efficient irrigation practices. We keep getting better. We keep getting in the irrigated business. We always do better in irrigation if Mother Nature blesses us with a lot of rain. But short of that, that's why we have irrigation. And we are really, in agriculture, water gatherers, because the better I do by saving water on my farm, the better wheat crop I grow, or the more pounds of beef I can produce and market. And so the more I can squeeze the most out of every drop, the better I am bottom line. And so I don't like to see that water run off any of my fields. And it's rather remarkable, about 15, 20 years ago, we started a terrace program in which we built a lot of terraces on our land, about every 400 or 500 feet apart, that would hold the water when we had a big rain event. And now my son doesn't like them because we have the increased residue. We rarely get a rainfall that washes off the field. And so the terraces aren't as important today, but Dad says they are, and that's why we maintain them. And occasionally they do stand water in them if we have over a 2 or 3 inch rain event. And so it's a combination of some of these things that help us keep the water on the land and make it into a crop, a better crop in the future. We're seeing some of these transformative agriculture practices. One of the difficulties we have with some of the regenerative agriculture here is rainfall area. It works a lot better the more rainfall you get. Same way with the mob or the savory type of grazing. And but we are working at a lot of those different new ideas. Actually, some of it is just a new name for some old practices, because farmers have been incorporating manure and anything else of organic nature back into the soil for years. And now we've got a new term for it. Silvopasture, that's basically grazing, livestock grazing in some of our wooded and forest areas. Great way to sequester more carbon. And yet at the same time, we have groups out there that are attacking agriculture, the grazing industry, that they ought to be off the public lands. How many of you know who Norman Borlaug is before you saw the slide? Well, a handful. Thank you. He's kind of a hero of mine. I never met him. I read a lot of his articles. I was in Mexico City and at his research station, there, Summit, and spent about a week there on what they're doing to improve the values of wheat. He's the only agronomist or agriculturalist that was given the Nobel Peace Prize, and it was mainly because he was attributed his work of saving the lives of over 1 billion people globally, because he took these tall wheats and was able to breed them down to what we call a semi-dwarf wheat, and it concentrated more of the energy in grain production rather than in straw production. And so he really curbed, especially in India and some other countries, the amount of starvation that was going on there. And it's estimated the genetics in the whole wheat breads that we've had experienced here, about half of that probably come from some of Borlaug's wheat varieties. And it's interesting what one of his quotes that I liked. He said, "The work of the Green Revolution is not yet finished." Where we heard green, revolution, things like that, it's what goes around comes around. But it will take a new round of technological advancement, political commitment, and I think that's what you're all about, commercial development and a lot of hard work to complete the job. And so I've oftentimes wondered who's the climate Borlaug of our day. Norman Borlaug got that award in 1970 and passed away about 10 years ago this month. There are a number of ag organizations that are working on climate change to different degrees. Here's just a few of them. I say some of our general farm organizations and some of our commodity and livestock organizations are developing environmental protection committees, water committees, and it's a different way of approaching climate change. And so I really encourage that because that's one of the common things. As we get warmer, we're going to probably have less water available, and that will have impact on how we raise livestock and produce grain. And I say some because not all the organizations are on board. A good friend of mine was state climatologist, and he got almost thrown out of a national organization meeting one time because he brought up climate change. And so it's very politically charged in some areas. Here are some growing ag producer trends. This is on our wheat farm. We've had a field research plot there for CSU for about 30 years. And I really think that farmers watch and do certain things if it's good for their bottom line. They don't do it necessarily because they are a climate change advocate or guru. They do it because these are improvements on how they've been doing things. They're using better genetics. In our farm alone, I think we've increased the yield of wheat by 10 bushel an acre on the average because of the genetics Colorado State University's been able to develop and some of our cultural practices. And so we think highly of Colorado State University as a resource. Precision ag, I mentioned earlier, it's with new technology. This is one of our tractors planting wheat this last week. You've got to do it at the right time, right place, right amount, right source, and in the right manner. And so that's capable of going through about any kind of residue and hopefully placing that in that seed where it'll germinate, produce a good crop this next year. GPS is popping up everywhere, new technology. The device that you all have in your pocket is being used in agriculture, but this all comes with a price. As I talked to my son the other day, the one that's off on his own with a lot of debt, he said, you know, I can't afford some of this equipment that I need. And so he continues to do more tillage because it's cheaper. It kills the weeds, but he probably loses more moisture, and I think he sacrifices some yield. But sometimes when you're between a rock and a hard spot financially, you can't always do what you would optimally want to do. I'm running out of time here, but I want to save enough for some Q&A, and so we can go back to some of these slides in a little bit. Farming from space, satellite imagery was great. When I was in Argentina several years ago, one of the farmers down there pulled up his satellite images and showed me where his pastures were, where he's grazing his cattle, where he was doing soybeans and his corn. And so the rest of the world is adapting a lot of this technology very rapidly. Irrigation, I was in Napa Valley a couple of years ago. Ernest and Julio Gallo's irrigationist is managing 29,000 acres of grapes with a satellite. And he's doing it a pixel at a time. In other words, about a 30 by 30 area, I think it's 30 yards by 30 yards, that he has set up for drip irrigation. And based on the imagery on how healthy that plant is or how stressed it is, because he stresses his grapes at certain times of the season to have a uniform sugar level on what he sells you, or their company sells you as wine. So the technology's there. It's if you can afford it. Right now you're not paying enough for bread for a wheat farmer to do all of that, but you must be for wine. So. Drones and data and imagery are really being employed rapidly. Again, it's a cost of technology. It's some things that some farmers can do. we probably need the capacity to understand what we're doing a little better than we have in the past with all this data. It's almost like we're getting too much data. Some of the large corporations that have dealings with agriculture, I think, are encouraging agriculture to do the right things sustainably. Walmart with their Project Gigaton, Coca-Cola with their zero water consumption efforts in their manufacturing process. Even here closer to home, Molson Coors is working with the barley producers up in northern Colorado as well as the San Luis Valley to be more efficient with water and energy. And so good stewardship is important for all of us. This is our oldest son and his oldest son a couple years ago. And so good stewardship of our natural resources is important, but profitability is essential. Because if a farmer is not profitable, can't pay the bills at the end of the day, he's not around in a year or two. And I've always said that good stewardship is so important in agriculture, and agriculture gave up the term environmentalist too easily and too long ago, because most farm families want to leave their farms in better condition than they received them for the next generation. And that is, I think, a strong definition of environmentalism. And so I think agriculture is really the original environmentalist. I talked a little bit about integrating our livestock operations. And again, keep in mind, we only have green vegetation a short period of time in the year. And so we have to put up forage or graze after the frost. And so integrating livestock has been quite helpful for some people. Keep in mind about 2/3 of the farms in Colorado have livestock and crops. There's only about 1/4 to 1/3 that are strictly crop production. Crop genetics, I mentioned what the CSU's done for us in the new varieties. And this can be said about a number of other commodities out there as well as the livestock industry. This is one thing I wanted to mention. We talked a little bit about this last night. Were you aware that the milk you buy today is produced by only half the number of dairy cows that we had 40 years ago? And that half of that dairy herd is producing 3 times as much milk as their ancestors did. And so this is the value of livestock genetics, good stewardship, and understanding how to make cows happy and keep them that way. And they're more productive. My wife didn't want me to put this slide in. She is the birder in our family. How many of you are birders? I had an alternative reason for encouraging her effort in recording what we have on our farm, because she has the Colorado record for the most species in her yard for about the last 5 or 6 years. And I just wanted to show, we have a lot of it through migration. But here's I think a canary in the coal mine type of indicator. I had never seen a roadrunner until I was in southern New Mexico about 45 years ago, 50 years ago. Now they're fairly common in southeastern Colorado. And it seems like the roadrunner belt is moving north as things dry out. And they're more adaptable to a drier climate. And for some reason, we have more of them visiting our farm. The Christmas bird count, that those birders will know what I'm talking about, rarely saw a roadrunner. And then 2 years ago, they had 15 roadrunners. And this is within, 10 days of Christmas that are taking up residence in southeastern Colorado. So there's certainly something going on out there. We love monarch butterflies, but as farmers, we tend to kill milkweed because we didn't realize the connection with milkweed and monarchs. And so that's changing through some USDA programs. Cover crops, there's that stripper header I was telling you about that runs backwards, but it just gleans the wheat off, and then we thrash it. We think keeping cover on the ground. We're not totally convinced in a low rainfall area that the vegetative growing crop is the answer because it uses so much of our moisture. But there's no question the more residue we can leave out there, Used to be the goal was to have the ground covered 30% with residue. Our goal is to get it to almost 100% because that thatch of material over there keeps the moisture in and dissipates erosion when you get hard rains. Another one of our fields just here a couple weeks ago when we planted it, this is what it looks like, the baby wheat coming up in that residue. The only time that had been touched was when it was planted as far as disturbing the soil. And so again, the more moisture we can hold, better our crop will be in the future. Land management continues to be a kind of each farmer has their own idea of how to farm. We found contour farming with those terraces we put in has saved us a lot of money, more than paid us back for what we did because the water no longer leaves and goes to the Mississippi River. It's also helped wildlife. We're seeing a lot more deer and antelope than we used to, and roadrunners. And so those are all things that farmers are employing. Renewable energy, we're fortunate to have some turbines I mentioned earlier on our farm. Every farm ought to have a couple wind turbines. Every county ought to have a wind farm because even though my son gets paid quite well for the acre and a half that comes out of production for 3 turbines, the county and the local taxing entities get even more on an annual basis. And so the tax base in rural areas from renewable energy, especially by investor-owned interests, have been a great thing for the bottom line on revenue for local governments. This is a U.S. that we're up to 11% renewable energy. People said it couldn't happen. I really think I appreciate the presentations today on how rapidly we're adapting renewables. We can also raise some renewable energy crops that go into ethanol as a bridge fuel. And we constantly been increasing our yields in spite of some of the climate change. In order to wrap up here, a couple of these last slides I think that are really important. This will be our, I think, 36th year on our farm next week to invite all the 6th graders in the West Prowers County School District to come out to our farm, and we conduct a tour. We talk to them mainly where their food comes from and what we're doing to try to save water and have better yields and have wildlife and all those things. And so that's always been a reward and interesting. But when you do it 36 times, what I'm finding now, I'm getting a little older because some of these kids that we originally had now are some of the teachers that are accompanying the kids. And so, but I see that as a good sign for our community. If you leave anything from my presentation today, I hope it is that agriculture is a big part of the solution. I'm interested in how the tax or the carbon market will work for agriculture, because as I mentioned, we can't pass our cost of production on, and it's really a big part of our bottom line. And so it's important that we continue these discussions. Social politics are important. I'll go about anywhere, any time to visit with people about what agriculture does and the importance of food and water in their lives. We have to continue to communicate with all sectors, and I appreciate some of the things I've learned about CCL and CCE. It seems like you're on the right course. And important to continue to use science-based education, not just feel-good type of thing. And I mentioned the carbon market. You know, about 10 years ago, we had the Chicago climate change. And we had a number of farmers in Colorado that prescribed to that and actually received some money from it. But they were only getting about $2 or $3 a ton for their efforts. And that thing eventually failed for a number of reasons, but it wasn't for a lack of farmer interest. And so I think that's got great potential. But my reasoning for that is this is generation 5 and 6 at our farm. Our youngest son and his oldest son that there's times I wonder, am I doing the right thing by encouraging him to stay in a high-risk business? Because today we're spending more in 1 day, 1 year of inputs than my father-in-law did in 10 years. He was dealing with 10-cent diesel and $5 a day labor and all those sort of things. Of course, he's only getting $1 a bushel for wheat, but still today, we're putting over $100 an acre into dry land. My irrigated friends are putting $800 to $900 in, depending on what their crop is. And so the risks are higher. Now the rewards and the good yields and good prices are good. But federal income tax has a way of leveling that off. And so I sometimes wonder, am I doing the 5th and 6th generation a service by passing the farm on to them, or should they also go and become an engineer? And so if you're ever south of Lamar, Colorado, and you see an old John Deere tractor sitting down by the highway, and it looks somewhat like this, that's our farm. Please stop in. Chances are I'm going to be out somewhere talking to people rather than at the farm, but my son will give you a tour. And so at this point, I'd like to stop, and I think we have a few minutes for some Q&A.
Looks like we have time for about 2 questions.
I'll bet we can crowd it into 3. If I don't.
No, I was saying we got about 2 questions. You can get one over there.
This is not really a carbon question, but this is a mega agriculture question. What do you think is the solution to enticing people to farm and to stay on the farm? Because and the other concern that I have is farms keep getting passed generation to generation and keep getting larger and larger, and there are fewer and fewer farms. And I just wondered how you view that kind of mega system.
I think it's done out of financial necessity. Our farms over the top of probably 30 homesteads. When the Homestead Act come in the 20s, people come out, try to make a living, and 160 or 320 acres was not enough in our country because of the rainfall. And so those people went elsewhere, and those farms become consolidated till you got to a economic basis. And that's what worries me, is you have to keep getting larger. Right now, I think our price of wheat's around, probably on inputs, depending on the yields, and that's around $4 a bushel. But right now we're getting $3.26, $3.50. And so we're selling at less than our cost of production. And we've seen over $1 decline in the last year because of international markets, some other factors. And so it doesn't matter, the bigger you are, if you're producing at less than the cost of production, you're going to fail. And then who picks up those failed farms oftentimes ends up being a corporate interest that has the staying power of 100 years, maybe an investment fund or something like that. And so you lose those family farms. Now we have 4 full-time employees, all family, have their families, and so our farm probably has 7 families that derive income out of where 30 used to. And so I don't like the trend. And then I've seen some small niche type of operations that work fairly well. They're getting a lot better prices than I am at farmers markets, things like that. But the volume isn't there to sustain them. They can't educate their kids, send them to college so those kids can make a decision. And so I really worry, and it comes down to profitability. I'd like to see those niche market farms make enough money to have a high quality of life. I want my sons to be able to continue. There's an old saying you may have heard that the only way you can get into agriculture nowadays is by the womb, the tomb, or the groom. And so think about that for a minute. That really keeps consolidating agriculture operations. There was a family farm that sold in our area, about a year ago. It was bought by an investment group out of Illinois. They paid more than any farmer could paid for even a portion of it. They said it's a long-term investment. And so that one family farm, it was large, he consolidated, much like our family has a lot of his neighbors, and is now in corporate hands. And I think they'll do a good job. They say the right things, but there'll be a change in the ethos, or whatever you call it, the spirit of the community that farm is going to operate in.
Thank you.
We're at 12.
I'll be around.
Let's thank our speakers.